We gather this hour.
We gather this hour.
We gather this hour.
We gather this hour as people of faith.
As people of faith.
As people of faith.
As people of faith.
With joys and sorrows.
With joys and sorrows.
With joys and sorrows.
Gifts and needs.
Gifts and needs.
Gifts and needs.
We light this beacon of hope.
We light this beacon of hope.
We light this beacon of hope.
Sign of our quest for truth and meaning.
Sign of our quest for truth and meaning.
In celebration.
In celebration.
In celebration.
Of the life we share together.
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 We share together.
We share together.
We share together.
Yes.
So yesterday, I caught a few minutes of this week's public radio program called This American Life. I'm sure many of you who listen to NPR are familiar with This American Life. If not, it's worth checking into. And the premise of this week's episode was sharing stories about how we, the big we of American culture, are trying to recover from, as they said, everything all at once. And the segment I caught was about a phenomenon I had not heard of, but a phenomenon called Shot Girl Summer, where ostensibly young, vaccinated singles, after a year and a half of isolation, were heading out into bars and nightclubs, searching for hookups and one-night stands, kind of a release of all this pent-up sexual energy. But as the reporter dug a bit deeper, an interesting thing emerged. She interviewed a lot of people, and they talked a lot about how crazy this hookup scene had become once the pandemic restrictions had been lifted, and everybody had stories. Bartenders claimed to have seen a marked increase in pants being left in the lost and found. But when the reporter asked patrons at a bar if they themselves had been having a lot of random sexual encounters, almost to a person, they eventually admitted, no, they weren't. One woman spoke of meeting someone at a bar, flirting with them for a while, and both of them making it pretty clear what they were after. She went home with them, but when they had left the noise and energy of the club and were now face-to-face alone, all either of them really wanted to do was just hold each other and talk. I found the story kind of moving because it felt so real to me, that longing for each other that we presume is one thing, but then turns out to be something else entirely, something far more tender, far more vulnerable than we thought it was. And it reminded me of a prayer written by the Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber, who's a Lutheran minister, a wonderful Lutheran minister in Denver. She leads a church called the House for All Sinners and Saints. Nadia prays, I am not who I was a year ago. I want so badly to hug my friends again and laugh like hell again and have amazing conversations again. And yet I am not sure how long I could do any of this before crying or just getting really quiet. My emotional protective gear has worn so thin, and grief just leaks out of everywhere now. I am so afraid that I will never be who I once was. And I'm also afraid that I will be. Not to mention, I'm not entirely clear what size jeans I wear as the me I am now. And yet, when I quiet my anxious thoughts, I start to suspect that I am now closer to the me you have always known and always loved. So help me trust that, Lord. As things change, help us be gentle with ourselves and with each other. We are all wearing newborn skin right now. Amen. Friends, we are not who we were a year ago. And as I watch us emerge from the trauma of the past year and a half, I wonder and I notice how much we keep expecting ourselves to be exactly like the way we were before. Even though we know that we have all changed profoundly. We have changed and we do not yet know in what ways. And so as we are moving back into the familiar spaces of our pre-pandemic life, we maybe don't even recognize ourselves, don't truly recognize each other. And we rush back into the restaurants and the parties and the vacations, the familiar social spaces, eager to reconnect. And we're trying to force ourselves back into the life we knew. But when we get there, we find our emotional protective gear has worn thin and our expectations of what our return would be is thwarted. I was thinking that this week yes, but as much the big we of our community, our nation, our world, we right now are in need of mercy. Now, mercy is one of those kind of tricky religious terms I trip over once in a while. I think we all have a sense of it, but once we try to pin its meaning down, it's kind of like pinning Jello to a wall. And yes, mercy is something about compassion and care and perhaps forgiveness and grace. It's kind of a radical kindness that arrives when we are at our most desperate, when the mess of our living could drag us into the abyss of sorrow or pain or addiction or depression. We think of mercy, and we think of mercy mostly when the person needing mercy does not necessarily deserve it from us or anyone else. That sense of mercy being undeserved, it made me wonder, if we are a people who truly live into the challenge of the Unitarian Universalist principle of affirming the inherent worth and dignity of all people, how could mercy ever not be deserved? Then again, in our broader culture, it seems so much like mercy is a rare thing. There is no mercy in our economy. There is no mercy in our policing. There is no mercy in our politics. The author Anne Lamott writes that mercy makes us look vulnerable and foolish. And so as children, many of us are taught to shove our mercy in a drawer, lest that particular weakness be exploited by others. There is no mercy in our love of winning. There is no mercy in our righteousness. And here specifically, I'm thinking of my own righteousness, unmerciful as it can be, at my irritation and frustration and outright anger these days at those who continue to refuse to be vaccinated against this virus. And as I read the news of new infections spiking back up and in the increases in deaths, almost all of whom are unvaccinated folks, whether by choice or by necessity, I confess I don't feel very merciful. I confess that I am often thinking that those people are only getting what they deserve. And I don't think I'm alone in that confession. Even when what those people deserve at this moment is mercy, is my mercy, particularly. And maybe because mercy is so hard for us to conjure, That's why we assign it to God. It feels like such a divine power out of reach for us mere mortals. But when we claim that all people have an inherent worth and dignity, and that we both affirm and promote this worth and dignity, we have to include all people, even those people, that person, right? And we remember that the prophet Micah writes in these famous lines, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good." He has shown you what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? To love mercy, to find in ourselves mercy, to awaken to love through mercy, even mercy to those people, to that person, the ones that challenge our sense of mercy, perhaps. And especially, friends, and I think this is maybe the hardest place for so many of us to remember that all people in our Unitarian Universalist claim of inherent worth and dignity, that all people, guess what? That includes you. That includes me. So perhaps mercy, it's forgiveness, mercy, it's compassion, mercy in its love. Perhaps that first begins with being merciful to ourselves. Reverend Boltz-Weber writes, I am so afraid right now that I will never be who I once was. And I am also afraid that I will be. I know I have changed in some ways. The grief and loss and isolation of the last year have allowed my emotions to come closer to the surface than usual. And I need more space and more time to reflect. I sink into my thoughts without realizing it, even when I'm around other people. I think my heart, she writes, I think my heart might be more open than ever. I don't feel nearly as defended. I used to have a bonkers schedule and was so busy, and now it's as if I can do up to one thing a day before feeling that stone pull me back into the quiet of my apartment. Friends, there are parts of us who we were that may not return. And there are parts of who we were that will remain. And there are parts of who we are now that are new or renewed. And there are parts of who we are now that will be revealed slowly. My invitation for you today in our collective emergence is to cultivate mercy, to love mercy, to be merciful to our own selves as we try to figure out who we are now, to be merciful with others as we feel the rawness, the loneliness, the emotions leaking out of that newborn skin. We are full of all this raw, pent-up energy, but it isn't what we thought it was. It most certainly isn't what we talk about. This energy is perhaps now closer to the me you have always known and always loved. So be tender with it. Don't try to dominate it. Don't try to win with it. Don't try to exploit it. But instead melt into it, into the arms of one another, being held in mercy as the newborn into love. Amen, my friends. And I love you, and may we live in blessing.